8 days. That's it. 8 days standing between Hungary and what many are calling the most electrically charged, dangerously consequential election this country has faced since the Iron Curtain came down. 8 days before millions of Hungarians walk into voting booths and decide not just who governs them, but whether they believe they are still the ones doing the governing at all. And Viktor Orbán, a man who has navigated 15 years of political warfare with the precision of a chess grandmaster, is no longer speaking in the careful diplomatic language of campaign season. He has dropped every pretense of measured political rhetoric. He is calling what is happening to Hungary by a name so blunt, so deliberately inflammatory, that it stopped conversations cold across every capital in Europe the moment the words left his mouth. He is calling it a coup, not a scandal, not a political dispute, not a disagreement over values or policy between Brussels and Budapest. A coup. Slow, calculated, dressed in the costume of democratic process, financed through channels that don't advertise themselves, and executed, in Orban's telling, not by soldiers or tanks, but by something far more sophisticated, by institutions, by money, by a transnational political machine that has decided Hungary's elected government is an obstacle to be removed rather than a sovereign authority to be respected. And the question rattling through every European newsroom, every diplomatic corridor, every political strategy room on the continent right now is not whether Orban is exaggerating. The question, the one nobody in Brussels seems to have a clean answer to, is why their response to his accusations has looked so much like the behavior of people who have something to hide. But before we get to that, before we get to the leaked documents, the lightning-fast Brussels reaction, and the 6 words Orban spoke to 40,000 people that may have just decided this election, we need to understand how Hungary arrived at this moment. Because this didn't start 8 days ago. This has been building for 15 years, one confrontation at a time. There is a version of Viktor Orbán that Brussels was perfectly comfortable with. The young, reformist, pro-Western politician who helped dismantle communism, championed EU membership, and spoke fluently the language of liberal democracy. That version of Orbán existed. He governed, he lost an election, he spent years in opposition, and then he came back. When Orbán returned to power in 2010, he didn't come back as a man eager to pick up where things left off. He came back carrying a mandate so large, a two-thirds parliamentary supermajority, that it gave him the legal authority to do something almost no European leader in the modern era has attempted. He decided to rebuild his country's political architecture from scratch. New constitution, restructured courts, redrawn electoral districts, a media landscape that, over the following years, shifted dramatically toward outlets aligned with his government. From inside the system, these moves looked like democratic backsliding. From where Orban stood, they looked like sovereignty Brussels watched. It complained, issued reports, opened proceedings. But in those early years, the EU had a fundamental problem it still hasn't fully solved. The European Union is extraordinarily effective at writing rules for people who agree to follow them. It is far less equipped to handle a member state government that looks at those rules, wins another election, and keeps going anyway. Then came 2015. The refugee crisis. The moment that turned a policy disagreement into something that felt genuinely civilizational to both sides. When the European Commission pushed mandatory migrant relocation quotas across member states, Orban didn't file a complaint. He didn't request an exemption through proper channels. He built a fence along Hungary's southern border, called it a defense of European culture, and dared Brussels to come take it down. Brussels took him to court instead. He won there too. From that point forward, the relationship between Budapest and Brussels stopped being a tension within a system and became a war over what the system was even for. Every year after 2015 added another layer of grievance, another precedent, another flashpoint. EU funding held hostage over rule of law concerns. Parliamentary resolutions condemning Hungary passed by margins that left no ambiguity about where the institution stood. Legal proceedings that seemed in their timing to arrive with suspicious electoral precision. Orbán absorbed all of it. He used all of it. Every Brussels sanction became evidence for the argument he was already making to Hungarian voters, that the pressure wasn't about principles. It was about power. It was about removing a government that refused to be managed. And then Peter Magyar arrived, and everything accelerated. Peter Magyar is not the kind of opposition figure that Orbán has spent a decade and a half defeating. He isn't a recycled party politician with tired talking points and a factional base that Fidesz already knows how to neutralize. He is something more dangerous to a system built on predictability. He is an insider who walked out. Magyar spent years in the circles that surrounded Orbán's government. His former wife served as a minister. He understood the machinery, how it worked, who it protected, what it concealed. When he turned against it publicly in early 2024, He didn't do so with the hesitant language of a whistleblower afraid of consequences. He did it loudly, specifically, and with the emotional register of someone who had genuinely reached a breaking point. The response was immediate. Crowds gathered. Not the obligatory crowds of party faithful bussed in for choreographed rallies, but the kind of spontaneous, energized turnout that political movements spend years trying to manufacture and almost never can. His party, TISA, went from non existent to competitive inside of months. For the first time in over a decade, Fidesz analysts were looking at polling numbers that made them genuinely uncomfortable. Orbán has never been a leader who underestimates a threat. He identified what Magyar represented almost immediately, and then he set about redefining it in terms that his voter base would understand and respond to. In the Fidesz framing, Magyar is not a dissident. He is not a corruption fighter. He is a project, a political vehicle assembled by external interests, road-tested for domestic palatability, and deployed with one specific objective: to produce an election result that delivers Hungary to the network of institutions, foundations, and financial structures that have wanted Orbán gone since before most of Magyar's current supporters were paying attention to politics. The names Orbán attached to this framing were not subtle. George Soros, Ursula von der Leyen, the Brussels institutional apparatus. He stated repeatedly and publicly that a vote for Magyar was not a vote for reform inside Hungary. It was a vote to transfer Hungarian sovereignty to people who don't live in Hungary, didn't build Hungary, and have no obligation to live with the consequences of their decisions about Hungary. What makes this narrative so difficult for the opposition to dislodge is not that it is obviously true, it is that it is not obviously false. Foreign-funded civil society activity inside Hungary is, by measurable standards, substantial for a country its size. EU institutions have been openly, unapologetically aligned against Fidesz in ways that go beyond procedural oversight. The financial conditionality attached to Hungary's frozen EU funds, roughly 20 billion euros held back since 2022, has been structured around reforms that would, as a direct side effect, strengthen exactly the kind of organizations that form the organizational backbone of opposition politics. You don't have to believe in a grand conspiracy to find that sequence of facts uncomfortable. You just have to be paying attention. Then came Tuesday morning, and everything Orbán had been saying for months suddenly had something tangible attached to it. The documents surfaced through a Hungarian investigative outlet. The outlet sits within the broader ecosystem of opposition-aligned media, a fact that will matter shortly. What the documents claimed to show was a financial network, money moving through shell company structures registered in Luxembourg, Cyprus, and the Netherlands, transfers that, when traced, pointed toward political infrastructure inside Hungary, infrastructure that benefited Magyar's TISA party. The sums were not incidental, the routing was not accidental, and the timing, arriving precisely 8 days before the election, was so deliberately calibrated that even journalists who would normally amplify anything damaging to Fidesz paused before publishing without caveats. In the architecture of information conflict, the when of a leak is as strategically important as the what. Whoever chose this Tuesday chose it because 8 days is long enough to cause maximum damage and short enough that a full rebuttal cannot be constructed and distributed before votes are cast. Orbán's government moved within the hour. State media, which commands the dominant share of Hungarian television, radio, and print audience, shifted into simultaneous high alert mode. Every Fidesz-aligned outlet ran the same essential story. Magyar is not who he presents himself to be. The financial infrastructure behind his political rise does not originate from Hungarian citizens who are tired of corruption. It originates from a coordinated transnational funding network with a single operational goal: get Orbán out and replace his government with one that will reverse Hungary's foreign policy independence, dismantle the legal barriers to unrestricted NGO activity, and reposition the country as a compliant member of whatever consensus Brussels decides to enforce next. Magyar's response came fast, too fast, some observers noted, for someone who had nothing prepared. He called the documents fabricated. He called the leak a classic Fidesz disinformation operation. He called the timing a political dirty trick, which it may well be. Orbán's government has a documented, extensively reported history of using every available instrument of state power against political opponents in ways that sometimes cross lines most European governments wouldn't approach. But here is where the rebuttal broke down. Magyar could not account for two specific transfers identified in the documents, not with counter-documentation, not with a timeline that held up under basic scrutiny. In a normal media environment, an inability to address two specific items out of a larger document set might be survivable. In a media environment where the dominant amplifiers are controlled by your opponent, an unconvincing denial doesn't just fail to convince, it functions as confirmation. What happened next is what transformed this story from a campaign season scandal into something that may define European politics for the next decade. 6 hours after the documents appeared, a German MEP from the Greens bloc, the European Parliament's designated rapporteur on Hungary, published a formal statement. The statement didn't express concern about the documents, it didn't call for an independent investigation. It declared them likely forgeries, the product of Hungarian intelligence services produced to manipulate the election outcome. Read that sentence again and think about the timeline. 6 hours, no forensic analysis, no access to original source documents, no independent verification of any kind. A definitive public conclusion, published under an official European Parliament designation, that the documents were fake, delivered before anyone outside the leak's origin point had time to examine them properly. The certainty was the tell. You reach that conclusion that fast only if you already know what the conclusion needs to be before you start looking. Orban's communications operation saw the opportunity immediately. They clipped the statement, stripped it to its most damning element, and within 24 hours it was on billboard networks across Budapest. 3 words above the MEP's name and affiliation. They knew already. It was the most effective piece of political communication either side produced across the entire campaign. Not because it proved a conspiracy, because it didn't need to. It just asked people to look at a sequence of events and apply the common sense they use for everything else in their lives. A leak appears. Brussels responds in hours. An official European Parliament figure calls it fabricated before anyone has checked. That official sits on the committee controlling the 20 billion euros frozen from Hungary's EU account. Connect the sequence yourself. That number, 20 billion euros, requires more attention than it typically receives in coverage of Hungary's conflict with Brussels because it is not simply a financial dispute. It is the clearest and most concrete expression of how the EU has chosen to fight this war. Hungary contributes to the EU budget. Hungarian taxpayers send money to Brussels as part of the standard membership framework. That money is then supposed to return to Hungary in the form of structural funds, cohesion payments, and development allocations. The financial architecture through which the EU's poorer Eastern members are supposed to gradually close the gap with the wealthier West. Brussels has been sitting on roughly 20 billion euros of Hungary's allocation since 2022. The stated reason is rule of law compliance failures, judicial independence concerns, media freedom issues, anti-corruption mechanism gaps. The conditions attached to releasing the funds are specific and detailed. They require changes that, if implemented, would restructure the legal framework governing NGO operations inside Hungary, the same NGO ecosystem that forms the organizational base of opposition political activity. Orban's response to this has been consistent and strategically coherent. He is not defending his rule of law record to a Western European audience that has already made up its mind. He is asking Hungarian voters a different and far more potent question. Who gave Brussels the authority to take money that belongs to Hungarian citizens and use it as a lever to force the Hungarian government to change laws it passed through a democratic parliament? The honest answer to that question, that financial conditionality is a standard EU tool applied across multiple member states, does not help Brussels here. Because the point is not whether the tool is legal, the point is whether it is legitimate in the eyes of the people being squeezed by it. And in Hungary, increasingly, the answer is no. This is the terrain where the opposition made its most consequential strategic error in this campaign. Every time Magyar's team engaged with the leak, every time they tried to debunk the Brussels interference narrative, every time they responded to a Fidesz provocation on Fidesz's chosen ground, they reinforced the very frame they needed to escape. They made the election a referendum on sovereignty versus submission, on Hungary versus Brussels, on national identity versus technocratic management from 4 countries away. Orbán has fought that election before. He has never lost it. Here is what the senior architects of EU policy understand and are struggling to say in public. This election stopped being about Hungary some time ago. Hungary has 12 million people. Its GDP is significant within Central Europe, but modest on the continental scale. In purely material terms, whether Orbán or Magyar governs Budapest should not register as an existential question for the European project. But elections aren't purely material. They are symbolic. They establish precedent. They demonstrate what is possible. And in doing so, they change what others attempt. If Orbán walks through this election and comes out the other side with his majority intact, having spent 8 days openly accusing the European Union of engineering a coup against his government and winning anyway, the message that sends across the continent is not subtle. It lands in Rome, where Giorgia Meloni is already in steady confrontation with EU budget and migration demands. It lands in Berlin, where a party that was considered politically unthinkable 3 years ago is now polling at levels that force serious people to take it seriously. It lands in Paris, where the argument that the EU is constitutionally incapable of respecting the democratic choices of its own member states has been building an electoral coalition for a decade and a half. Orbán surviving doesn't just keep Orbán in power, it creates a proof of concept. It demonstrates that a mid-sized European government can absorb institutional pressure, financial punishment, coordinated international opposition, and a well-funded domestic challenger, and still hold. It tells every government on the continent that has been quietly capitulating to Brussels on issues their voters oppose that capitulation may not actually be necessary. That is the scenario that turns EU officials blood cold, not the man, the model, and Brussels, in its panic, may have done precisely what a person does when they are too afraid to think clearly. It moved too fast. It showed too much. It responded to a leak within hours in a way that looked not like institutional confidence, but like institutional anxiety. It published conclusions before evidence. It deployed its most prominent Hungary-focused parliamentary figure to deliver a verdict that arrived faster than the facts could have possibly supported it. In doing so, it handed Orbán something he could not have manufactured himself: authenticity. The coup narrative works not because every Hungarian voter believes there is a literal conspiracy with signed documents and secret meetings. It works because the behavior of the institutions Orbán is pointing at looks to ordinary people watching in real time like the behavior of people who are very worried about something and very eager to control how it's being talked about. That gap between how an institution describes itself and how it actually behaves in a moment of pressure, that gap is where Orbán has built his entire political career. And in the final days of this campaign, Brussels handed him that gap gift-wrapped. 2 days before the vote, Orbán held a rally in Debrecen. 40,000 people. State television carried it live across the country. He didn't deliver a comprehensive policy address. He didn't walk through his government's achievements in infrastructure or GDP growth or energy independence. He didn't rebut the opposition's corruption allegations line by line. He looked into the camera, directly into it, as if the audience in the stadium was secondary to the audience watching at home. And he said 6 words: "They are not coming for me." Then a pause, long enough for the sentence to settle. "They are coming for you." No elaboration, no list of evidence, no rhetorical scaffolding. Just 6 words dropped into a country where the memory of what external control actually felt like, Soviet occupation, IMF austerity conditions, the accumulated weight of decisions made in foreign capitals about Hungarian lives, is not distant history. It is a living inheritance, something carried in family conversations, in the texture of how older Hungarians talk about institutions that promise one thing and deliver another. 6 words like that, in that context, don't ask for intellectual agreement. They ask for a feeling. And Viktor Orbán, whatever one thinks of his governance record, his democratic credentials, or his political ethics, is perhaps the most sophisticated practitioner alive of the art of producing a feeling in an electorate and making it last until election day. The votes are 8 days away. They will be counted. A result will come. And then, regardless of that result, the question that this election has elevated into European political discourse will remain unresolved, unavoidable, and more urgent than at any point since the EU's founding framework was constructed. Can a supranational institution override the democratically expressed preferences of a member state's population, freeze their funds, back their opposition, coordinate institutional pressure against their elected government, and describe all of that as the defense of democracy? Can it do all of those things and then express surprise when the government it is targeting calls it by a different name? Europe has been avoiding a clean answer to that question for 15 years. Brussels developed elaborate procedural language, lengthy legal frameworks, and a vocabulary of values-based conditionality precisely to avoid having to answer it directly. In 8 days, Hungary stops waiting for Europe to answer. Hungary provides an answer of its own. And whether Fidesz holds or falls, whether Magyar reaches the threshold that turns TISA into a governing force or falls short of it, that answer, delivered by 12 million people in a country that has spent the last decade being told by its neighbors what democracy is supposed to look like, will echo in ways that Brussels, Washington, and every chancellery between them will spend years trying to process. Orbán said it's a coup. Brussels said that's a lie. 8 days from now, Hungarian voters will tell us who they believe, and the rest of Europe will discover, possibly for the first time, just how far the gap has grown between what its most powerful institutions think they represent and what the people living inside them actually think they are. That's where we stand. If you want to understand the deeper architecture of what is happening between Brussels and Budapest, how financial conditionality became a political weapon, how the EU's rule of law framework became a contested battlefield, and what a Fidesz victory or defeat actually means for the continent's future, make sure you're following this channel. The result is 8 days away. We will be here when it lands.